On the 28th of May 1947, inside the walls of Landsberg Prison, a brutal and ruthless guard who worked inside of the concentration camps was led to the gallows. He was accompanied by many American military policemen, and he was led up to the execution structure as the executioner was waiting for him. Johann Altfuldisch was also known for his horrific actions inside of Sachsenhausen Concentration Camp, and he became the second highest ranking officer within Mauthausen, which was said to have been one of the most severe and shocking camps of the whole of the Third Reich. Prisoners here had to contend with the stairs of death, a huge flight of steps. They were driven up and down by the ruthless guards many times each day, and this was very dangerous. But Johann Altfuldisch was known inside of Mauthausen for beating prisoners to within an inch of their lives, and he was then involved in many executions that were carried out at the site, and he also ordered a number of them. But what else did he do that sent him towards a gallows inside the American-occupied prison? Welcome to The Untold Past. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Johann Altfuldisch was born on the 11th of November 1911 inside of Bruckenau in Germany, and as a young boy there was very little to suggest that he would become a brutal and barbaric executioner who was responsible for the deaths of thousands of people. He attended school like any normal German boy, and he following this began to work and train as an upholsterer and also as an apprentice decorator, and following passing his school exams he continued to work until he became unemployed in 1929 at the age of 17 or 18. But like many people were at the time, he looked towards radical groups in politics to help his situation, and on the 1st of January 1930 he officially joined the Hitler Youth. This was the youth group of the Nazi Party for boys and teenagers, and this taught thousands of youngsters how to train to become soldiers. They were given basic training in the event of them fighting should a war break out. The members were taught basic weapons handling, military drills, and things such as grenade throwing. But on the 1st of September 1931, Altfuldisch officially became a member of the SS, which was being expanded at the time. The SS began life as a bodyguard unit set up to protect Adolf Hitler. However, many more people were joining them. They would later become the guards who staffed the concentration camps and caused the deaths of millions. Altfuldisch would, on the 24th of September 1933, first enter a concentration camp, and he worked as a guard inside of Dachau. This was the first site that opened inside of Nazi Germany, and it was known for its brutal and barbaric treatment of prisoners. After a number of years, he was transferred to the command staff, and he was sent briefly to the Columbia concentration camp, but after this was shut down, he was then sent on towards Sachsenhausen. He continued to serve in the command staff, and in this role Altfuldisch was overseeing large amounts of guards who were responsible for the brutal and terrifying violence that they inflicted amongst others. Further transfers came for him, firstly back to Dachau, but then on to Mauthausen concentration camp before the Second World War broke out. Johann Altfuldisch arrived at Mauthausen in August 1938. Mauthausen as a camp was opened around this time, when prisoners from Dachau, the first concentration camp, were sent there to construct a new slave labour camp. It was chosen as it was very close to a granite quarry which was nearby, and also transport links as it was close to Linz, Hitler's hometown. Before the Nazis created the camp there, the granite mined at the site was used to pave the streets of Vienna, but Hitler had huge visions for architectural projects, building a new Germania, and for these projects a huge amount of granite was required. This was very expensive, and Hitler would rather spend his money on his army and preparing for war rather than purchasing stone. So because of this, a prisoner of war camp was opened up there, and a slave labour site where inmates were forced to conduct backbreaking work mining the stone was established. Mauthausen grew into a huge complex with many different subcamps being found, including the Gusen camps, which held a significant amount of prisoners itself. In terms of production output, Mauthausen was far more productive than Auschwitz was, and it had the biggest output of any camp, but for this the SS guards would have to drive the inmates incredibly hard. Other factories were built around Mauthausen, and 45 companies would establish themselves there, utilising the slave labour. Some of the companies were part of the war effort, but some were not. The camp was turning over profits of millions of Reichmarks each year, and inmates were even rented out to work on other sites, including local farms. The main point of the camp was to exterminate the prisoners through labour, working them as hard as they could and getting the most out of them until they died and could not do any more. It was one of the most severe camps, with inmates suffering from malnutrition and a huge amount of overcrowding. The living quarters were not sufficient, so disease also spread quickly around Mauthausen, and there were daily beatings administered by the SS guards and also the capos. There was a medical facility established, known as the Krankenlager, but no medication was offered and only basic first aid was handed out. Experiments also occurred at Mauthausen, and the average life expectancy of a newly arrived prisoner was around 6 months from when they first set foot in the camp, and this deteriorated to just 3 months by the end of the war. The situations of the inmates got very worse, and food rations began to be decreased each month, leading to prisoners being even unable to stand up as they were so weak, and those who were not well enough to work were then sent to sites such as Hartheim Castle, where they were exterminated within the gas chambers there. One of the most striking elements of Mauthausen was certainly the Stairs of Death. This was a huge rock quarry found at the base of the stairs, and the stairs were 186 large stone steps, where prisoners carrying as much as 50-kilogram stones were forced to walk up, one after the other, up the huge steps, many times a day. It was back-breaking work, quite literally, and SS guards would whip and beat the prisoners, forcing them up the stairs a lot quicker. Accidents were very common, and if an inmate collapsed in front of the other prisoner in the line, they would often take the prisoner out behind them, and a domino effect would be created. Prisoner after prisoner would fall over, and in the quarry they were forced to carry boulders all day, from morning until night, up the steps and over to the other side. SS guards would whip and beat them heavily, and drive them quicker up the stairs. Inside of Mauthausen Concentration Camp, Johann Altfuldisch served as a block and rapport leader, and in 1941 he was given command of the Postal Censorship Office. With this he was controlling all mail that went in and out of Mauthausen, and he oversaw a number of prisoners who worked in the office with brutality. Altfuldisch became known for being involved in many of the executions that occurred inside of Mauthausen. A former prisoner stated of his actions that, the former prisoner Josef Kerl reports, "I remember a case from his time as a rapport leader when he hit a Mussulman prisoner who was standing freezing in the corner of the barracks with his comrade with a single kick, so he collapsed dead. He was one of the most brutal, violent thugs. The number of prisoners killed or abused by him is very high. He was clearly someone who was well thought of inside of the SS and was promoted to the commandant of the Leibnitz subcamp. But he was not well suited to this, and was then sent back to Mauthausen, where he was given the role of the second protective custody camp leader, and in this job he would have tortured and executed many prisoners. At the end of the Second World War, Johann Altfuldisch gave himself up to American officials, and he was arrested by the US Secret Service, and was moved to Dachau concentration camp to be brought to trial as a defendant of the Mauthausen trial. It was said of the court that the witnesses interviewed accused Hans Altfuldisch, who was recently the second protective custody camp leader in Mauthausen, of not only having beaten prisoners himself, but above all, of having been present when it came to the murder of certain groups, such as Allied prisoners of war. He often took part in executions, just as he was at least present in the corner of the neck during shootings. Shortly before liberation, Altfuldisch also ordered gassings in the Mauthausen gas chamber. As Obersturmführer and second protective custody camp leader, Altfuldisch had a relatively high rank, and because of this function, command authority, but he did not limit himself to this, but he also murdered himself. On the 13th of May 1946, Johann Altfuldisch was sentenced to death after being found guilty of crimes against humanity. He was then sent to Landsberg Prison to await his execution, and he remained on death row inside of the American-occupied prison for over a year. On the 28th of May 1947, he was informed that his execution would take place, and he was led out of his prison cell towards the gallows, which were found inside of a courtyard. Accompanying Altfuldisch were many American military policemen who were there to ensure his execution went well, and he was then led towards the execution structure. A priest accompanied him on the walk to his death and offered him spiritual guidance, but he was then led up the stairs of the gallows once his identity had been confirmed. Altfuldisch was then handed over to the executioner, and his last words were, "I'm dying for Germany," and the executioner worked swiftly, placing a black cap over his head, and then secured the noose around his neck. He then released a trapdoor that Johann Altfuldisch was stood on, and the former brutal guard of Mauthausen was sent to his death. Johann Altfuldisch was considered a brutal and barbaric concentration camp guard, who at the end of the war turned himself over to the authorities. He was hunted as the Allied authorities learned of his treatment of inmates inside of Mauthausen and other camps. He was a very experienced guard, and he also ordered and carried out execution and torture of many prisoners. When prisoners saw Johann Altfuldisch inside of the camps, they knew that violence would soon follow. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.